She did it on purpose. Archie and Lily have finally...
Just when the world thought the custody battle had finally been put to rest, a single document reignited the fire. The deal was signed, sealed, and quietly filed until one unexpected name surfaced, buried in a detail Meghan never intended anyone to see. Prince Andrew. Its appearance sent shockwaves through royal watchers and raised uncomfortable questions the palace won't answer. So, was it a clerical coincidence, a strategic move, or a link more deliberate? What this hidden detail reveals could change everything, with consequences nobody expected. The morning the palace stopped whispering. It did not begin with raised voices, slammed doors, or flashing cameras. There was no warning, no spectacle, no public drama. It began the way the most serious things often do, with silence so deep it felt heavy. Just after dawn, when the sky over Windsor was still pale and unsure of itself, a single red folder was delivered to the castle. It was not the kind used for ceremonies or daily schedules. This folder did not carry polite updates or harmless briefings. It was thick, sealed, final, the kind that makes footsteps slow and conversations stop mid-sentence. Those who handled it knew at once that this was different. Years of palace work teach aides how to recognize danger before it speaks. This folder carried the quiet weight of something that could not be unseen. Once opened, it would change the shape of the day, and perhaps much more. Inside was information no palace ever wants to face. It was detailed, formal, and carefully written. Every line had been checked, every word chosen with care. There was no anger in it, no emotion. That was what made it so chilling. It spoke not of gossip or disagreement, but of concern. Documented, measured, and deeply serious. By midday, the stillness broke. Buckingham Palace released a confirmation that stunned even those who thought they had seen everything. Archie and Lilibet, the youngest members of the royal family, were no longer considered to be under Meghan Markle's custodial influence. The words were simple, almost plain, yet behind them sat a decision of enormous weight. This was not rumor whispered to reporters. It was not pressure from the public or noise from social media. This was the Crown, acting through its oldest systems, using authority it rarely touched. What unsettled insiders most was not only what had been done, but how quickly it happened. The monarchy is known for patience. Decisions usually move slowly, wrapped in layers of tradition, reviews, and careful delay. Time is its shield. Speed is almost never its choice. Yet this decision had moved like a door suddenly slammed shut. Fast, clean, final. That speed sent a clear message to those inside the palace walls. Something had crossed a line. This was not about hurt feelings or broken family ties. It was not a clash of personalities or a private disagreement turned public. It was not even custody in the usual sense of courts and paperwork. At the center of it all was fear. Not loud fear, not panic, but a quiet, steady fear, backed by records, reports, and repeated concern. Fear that two children tied to the crown were being slowly pulled away from the anchors meant to protect them. Fear that their sense of identity was fading. Fear that stability, so carefully guarded for royal children, was being weakened day by day. Everyone close to the issue chose their words cautiously. They talked about well-being, stability, and protecting the future as if everything was under control. Yet behind that measured language was a quiet unease. Time was no longer neutral. Each pause, each postponement carried its own danger, turning waiting itself into a growing threat that could no longer be ignored. And one misstep might reshape outcomes forever for everyone involved there. For the Crown, this was not about control. It was about duty. The belief that when protection is required, hesitation can be harmful. That when warning signs stack up, silence becomes a choice, and sometimes the wrong one. No one celebrated the decision. There were no winners, only a shared understanding that something fragile was at stake, and that action, however painful, had been deemed necessary. And so it began. Not with noise, but with stillness. A red folder at dawn, a decision by noon, and a reminder that in the quiet halls of power, the most dramatic turns often arrive without a sound. What prompted the decision of the royal palace to take charge of the children's custody? Could it be due to an unsettled score? Could it be the effect of Megxit? Let's find out what paved the way for the move. The disappearance that triggered the crown. Just days before the palace made its next move, a quiet discovery on the other side of the world set off a chain reaction no one expected. At a private school in California, a school administrator noticed a strange gap in the records. Two names that had always been there, Archie and Lilibet, were suddenly missing. At first, it seemed like a simple clerical issue. Children change schools all the time. Families relocate. Paperwork gets delayed. But this time, something felt wrong. There had been no notice of withdrawal, no letter from parents, no request for transcripts, no formal transfer to another school. Even more unsettling was the silence. No communication with child welfare liaisons connected to the UK, and no updates to mediators already involved in existing custody arrangements. For children with international ties and layered protections, this kind of disappearance was not just unusual, it was unheard of. The administrator followed protocol and sent a report up the chain. It was short, factual, and carefully worded, but the tone carried weight. No show. Immediate concern. Within systems connected to royalty, children do not simply fade out of official records. Their lives are carefully documented across schools, hospitals, trusts, and legal frameworks. Every move leaves a trace. When those traces suddenly stop, it does not suggest privacy. It suggests a breach. As the report made its way across departments and eventually reached palace officials, a deeper review began. What they found only raised more questions. Scheduled pediatric appointments had been quietly canceled. Follow-up visits were never rescheduled. Messages from welfare contacts went unanswered. Education-related trusts that had once been active were dissolved without explanation. Channels that once allowed routine updates were suddenly blocked. Even more striking was the legal shift. Law firms previously engaged in structured cooperation were instructed to cut off royal lines of communication entirely. Not delay, not renegotiate, cut off. To palace analysts, these were not random decisions. Each action pointed in the same direction. This was not chaos. It was planning. What troubled them most was the pattern. When families prepare for negotiation, especially sensitive ones involving children, they usually increase communication, not erase it. Records are preserved. Access remains open. Safeguards are reinforced. Here, the opposite was happening. The silence was deliberate. The doors were closing one by one. As analysts mapped the timeline, a stark conclusion began to take shape. This was not preparation for a discussion or a compromise. This was preparation for a clean break. And not just a personal one. This went beyond marital distance or emotional separation. The steps taken suggested a deeper intention. To remove the children entirely from long-standing structures, educational, legal, and symbolic, that connected them to the royal system. In other words, this was not only about distancing from Harry's past. It looked like an effort to sever ties with the monarchy itself. For an institution built on continuity, lineage, and record-keeping, that realization landed heavily. Royal systems are designed to absorb conflict, adapt to change, and survive public storms, but they are not designed for disappearance. When something or someone slips beyond their reach, it signals a loss of control that cannot be ignored. Across continents, phones rang. Files were reopened. Old assumptions were questioned. What had once been treated as a family matter was now viewed through a different lens, one of long-term consequence. Because when children connected to the crown vanish from official view, it is never just about where they are. It is about what future they are being quietly removed from. And who made that decision? How did the royal palace respond to the sudden news of the missing children? Who was at the center of everything? Let's delve into the details of how the royal palace stood for the children. When the crown chose the children, Princess Anne did not pause to test the mood of the public or wait for the media to spin the story. She moved first. Quietly, but firmly, she called an emergency meeting inside the palace walls. There were no pleasantries, no careful easing into the matter. When she entered the room, she carried a red folder, thick, heavy, and unmistakably serious. She placed it directly in front of King Charles, her expression set, her message clear before she even spoke. There was no soft language, no attempt to cushion the truth. "This is no longer about reputation," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "This is about children being taken out of safety without clear explanation." The room fell silent. This was not the kind of concern that could be brushed aside with press statements or polite denials. This was not about headlines, popularity, or bruised pride. It was about responsibility and risk. Moments later, Prince William was called in. He was handed the folder and asked to read the final page. As his eyes moved across the words, something changed. Those present noticed it immediately. His face didn't show anger or panic. Instead, it showed resolve. When he finally spoke, his tone was calm, almost measured, but his words carried weight. "This is no longer about Meghan," he said. "It is about survival, emotional, legal, and historical." That single sentence reframed everything. What followed was swift and deeply serious. Within hours, the palace began activating protocols that had not been used in generations. Rules and safeguards that existed more as history than as practice. These were not routines meant for public view. They were quiet mechanisms designed for moments when the crown believed something precious was at risk. The first actions were immediate. Passports were frozen, not as a show of power, but to prevent sudden movement that could complicate already fragile circumstances. The commercial use of the children's names was shut down completely. No branding, no deals, no future contracts built around identities that could not yet consent or understand the consequences. Then came something even larger, a trust of unprecedented scale. It was created not as a reward or a weapon, but as a shield. The funds were clearly assigned: education, therapy, long-term care, and what insiders described as reintegration. The language mattered. This was not about exile or separation. It was about ensuring that if the children ever needed support beyond their immediate environment, it would already be waiting for them. And this was not punishment. That point was stressed again and again within the council. Every step was framed as protection. For the first time in modern royal history, the crown began preparing to assume direct guardianship, not out of anger and not as revenge, but as a safeguard against disappearance. A firewall, a last line of defense. When Prince William formally invoked a clause of royal law that had sat dormant for decades, few in the room needed further explanation. That clause existed for rare moments, times when the crown believed that the future itself was at stake, not in theory, but in real human lives. The vote that followed was unanimous. There were no dramatic objections, no last-minute hesitations. Everyone understood what crossing that line meant. Once the crown acts at that level, it does not reverse course. It does not quietly redraw boundaries or pretend the moment never happened. This was not a public spectacle. It was not meant to be. The monarchy, stripped of its pomp and public image, revealed its oldest purpose: a steadfast guardian, keeping alive what must endure and shielding those too vulnerable to defend themselves. In that quiet, weighty duty lies a power far beyond crowns or titles. History proves that once such a responsibility is embraced, it is irreversible, an unbroken chain that binds past, present, and future, leaving no path to retreat. Where was Harry in the middle of these? Was he unaware of the games? Let's dive into the details of Harry's position in the middle of all these. The fall of a narrative and the isolation of Harry. As the palace closed in on itself, the change did not come with alarms or breaking headlines. There were no public statements, no dramatic confrontations, no raised voices echoing through gilded halls. Instead, Meghan felt her world begin to thin out, quietly, carefully, almost politely. One day, meetings were postponed. The next, they were under review. Streaming projects that once felt secure were suddenly paused for strategic reasons. Brand partners who had been eager, even proud, to be associated with her vision stopped returning calls. Emails went unanswered, calendars emptied. It was subtle enough to be confusing. Nothing had officially ended, yet everything was slipping away. Even the smallest details began to change. The children's names, once carefully placed in archives, metadata, and long-term marketing plans, started disappearing. They were removed from drafts, erased from decks, quietly edited out of records, as if they had never been there at all. No explanation followed. None was needed. This was how power worked in that world. Nothing dramatic. Text wrapping. Break. Nothing loud. Text wrapping. Break. Just doors closing one by one. Hollywood, after all, does not scream when it loses interest. It does not argue or explain itself. It simply goes quiet. And in an industry built on attention, silence is not neutral. It is deadly. Silence means you no longer matter. Silence means the room has moved on without you. Inside this growing quiet, Prince Harry struggled to find his footing. By all accounts, he believed there was still space for negotiation, a middle ground, a compromise that would allow everyone to save face. He had lived long enough within institutions to think that rules could bend, that exceptions could be made, that personal history still counted for something. So he asked for time, for flexibility, for temporary custody while matters were sorted out. The answer came back cold and precise. The request was denied, not because of anger, text wrapping break, not because of punishment, text wrapping break, but because of process. The reasons were laid out neatly, almost kindly: unstable residency, unresolved travel limitations, and lingering financial questions. On paper, it made perfect sense. There was no mention of love, intent, or personal pain. Feelings had no place in the decision. This was not emotional. Text wrapping break. It was procedural, and that somehow made it worse. When the final letter arrived, it did not come through lawyers or press leaks. It came through royal channels, formal, sealed, unquestionable. The message was clear and final. Custody, guardianship, and decision-making authority would now fall fully under Crown protocol. Any visits would happen under strict conditions. Nothing would be assumed. Everything would be supervised. Harry read it more than once, as if another meaning might appear between the lines. It did not. The irony was hard to ignore. The man who had spent years criticizing royal systems, exposing their coldness and rigidity, was now caught inside one of them. Bound by rules he no longer had the power to challenge. The system had not changed. It had simply turned toward him. He was no longer the outsider speaking truth to power. He was a subject of it, separated from what he was trying to protect. Text wrapping break. drifting without leverage, text, wrapping break, surrounded by structures that moved slowly but never reversed. There were no public scenes, no dramatic moments captured by cameras, just a steady narrowing of options. A sense of being managed rather than heard. Each decision framed as reasonable, each outcome presented as inevitable. And perhaps that was the most unsettling part of all. Nothing had exploded. Nothing had collapsed overnight. Yet somehow everything was gone. By the time the full weight of it settled in, there was no door left to knock on. The silence had already done its work. What once felt negotiable had hardened into policy. What once felt temporary had quietly become permanent. Too late. How did the custody deal eventually end up in favor of the Crown? Was it a makeshift deal? Was it temporary? Or was it final? Let's dig into the details of the custody deal and how the palace celebrated the victory. The quiet victory of permanence. The palace did not throw a party. There were no cheers, no victory speeches, no public smiles meant for the cameras. Instead, something far more serious happened. The palace adjusted itself, quietly, carefully, and with purpose. Like an old machine that knows exactly how to correct its balance, it shifted gears without making noise. At the center of that quiet shift was Catherine, the Princess of Wales. She did not step forward with announcements or statements. She stepped in with structure, with calm, with care. Her role was not political and not performative. It was human. She focused on the children, on their emotions, their routines, their sense of safety. Therapy was arranged, not as punishment or damage control, but as support. Days were kept predictable. Bedtimes stayed the same. Familiar faces remained close. Nothing was rushed. Nothing was forced. George and Charlotte were not given instructions like soldiers following orders. They were gently guided, encouraged to include Lilibet as a sister, not as a symbol. No pressure, no scripts, no whispered warnings about what to say or how to behave. Just kindness, modeled and allowed to grow naturally. Children understand far more than adults often realize, especially when they are trusted. And then there was the photograph. It did not arrive with a caption full of meaning or a statement dripping with intention. It simply appeared. Two children, one hand holding another. No dramatic framing, no heavy editing, no explanation. And yet, it said everything. It showed what stability looks like, what quiet protection feels like, what belonging means when it is real. In a world overflowing with words, the image needed none. People paused when they saw it. Some felt comfort. Others felt unease. Because the picture carried a truth that could not be argued with. Not long after, a carefully arranged image appeared online, polished, emotional, and clearly designed to shift the public story. It was meant to reclaim control, to rewrite the moment, to suggest empowerment, struggle, and strength all at once. The palace did not argue. It did not counter with another photo. It did not leak information or fuel debate. It responded with one sentence, actually, 3 short lines. Empowerment is not manipulation. Text wrapping break. Protection is not obstruction. Text wrapping break. Silence is not absence. That was all. But it landed like a door closing. Those words did not explain. They defined. They drew a line between care and control, between privacy and secrecy, between strength and performance. They reframed the entire story without ever naming it. And once spoken, they could not be undone. After that, things moved quickly, but quietly. Custody arrangements were no longer up for discussion. The matter was settled, not through noise but through process. Image rights were locked down, sealed with legal weight and royal authority. No more blurred lines. No more uncertainty about who decided what. and for whom. Most importantly, authority shifted. Not temporarily, not symbolically, permanently. What many thought was a personal family conflict revealed itself to be something else entirely. This was not about feelings alone. It was not about popularity or public sympathy. It was about duty, legacy, and the protection of the institution itself. The monarchy does not survive by reacting emotionally. It survives by correcting course when the balance is threatened. That is what happened here. No one was humiliated. No one was publicly defeated, but the rules were reasserted, the boundaries were restored, and the future was quietly secured. What began as a very public family drama, played out through headlines, interviews, and images, ended as something much colder and much older than emotion. It ended as a constitutional correction, and in that stillness, with no applause and no celebration, the palace proved once again that its greatest power has never been noise. It has always been control. How did Andrew get into the picture? What business did Andrew have with Meghan Markle? Let's take a look at the narration that reopens Meghan's past with Andrew, something she dreaded leaking out in the present day. A claim that refused to fade. For years, deep inside royal circles, there was a story that never quite went away. It was not shouted from headlines or printed in official statements. Instead, it lived quietly, passed from one careful voice to another, lingering in whispers and raised eyebrows. No one ever stood up to confirm it. No one firmly shut it down either. It was simply left alone, as if time itself would erase it. But time didn't. The claim stayed. At its core, the idea was simple but unsettling to some. Prince Andrew had known Meghan Markle long before Prince Harry ever met her. Not in the way tabloids love to imagine. There were no secret romances, no dramatic confrontations, no hidden love letters. That was never the point. This was not a story about passion or betrayal. It was about something quieter and perhaps more revealing. It was about access. Those who spoke about it stressed one thing again and again. Meghan and Andrew moved in nearby worlds long before her name became tied to the British royal family. These worlds were not open spaces where anyone could walk in. They were closed environments, carefully managed and tightly controlled. You didn't enter because you were famous. You entered because you were invited, and invitations were shaped by power, money, and connections. According to insiders, this was not a coincidence of chance encounters. It was a pattern. Private gatherings where guest lists were small and discreet, exclusive dinners hosted by wealthy figures whose names rarely appeared in public, charity events that were less about giving and more about who you met behind closed doors. These were places where titles mattered less than influence, and where faces became familiar even if names stayed unspoken. Andrew, long before his public fall from grace, was known for occupying such spaces. He had a reputation for moving comfortably among financiers, social elites, and international power brokers. He was not always the most visible royal, but he was often present where influence flowed quietly. Meghan, too, had begun to appear in similar circles during her years in entertainment and humanitarian work. She wasn't royalty then. She wasn't even widely famous in Britain. But she was visible in the kinds of rooms where introductions mattered more than headlines. People who noticed this overlap did not describe it as accidental. They spoke of a system, an unspoken network where certain individuals kept crossing paths because the doors were opened by the same hands. The same hosts, the same exclusive venues, the same unseen gatekeepers deciding who belonged. This is why the claim never disappeared. It didn't rely on one dramatic moment. It relied on repetition, familiar faces showing up in familiar places, quiet nods of recognition, a sense that this was all part of a structure most people never see. For years, the palace did what it often does best. It said nothing. Silence softened the edges of the claim. Without confirmation or denial, the story slipped into the background, dismissed by some as speculation and curiosity. But circumstances have changed. Prince Andrew is no longer shielded by the full protection of royal restraint. His role has diminished. His distance from official duties has grown. And with that distance has come a new willingness among observers, commentators, and insiders to revisit old questions. Questions that once felt impolite now feel unavoidable. Did Andrew recognize Meghan before Harry introduced her? Text wrapping break. Had their paths crossed in ways the public was never meant to know? What does that say about how tightly connected elite worlds really are? What makes the claim more intriguing is not what it accuses, but what it reveals. It suggests that power does not move randomly. It circulates. It creates familiar roots. People meet, not because of fate, but because systems quietly bring them together. And now, as Andrew stands further outside the royal spotlight, the claim is no longer fading. It is resurfacing, stronger, sharper, and harder to ignore. Not because new proof has appeared, but because silence no longer feels like an answer. In the end, the story remains unresolved, yet its persistence tells its own truth. Some claims refuse to die not because they are dramatic, but because they feel plausible in a world built on closed doors and carefully managed access. So, what do you think about the custody arrangements? Do you think Meghan will recover from the news of her past with Andrew? We'd love to hear your opinions in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe.